Shabbat Shalom. I'm Cantor David Proser of Kempsville Conservative Synagogue, Kehillat Bet HaMidrash, and this is our Torah portion for August 15th, 2020, corresponding to the 25th day of the Hebrew month of 5780. We thank Rabbi Joseph Prauser, Rabbi Michael Gold, Rabbi Avram Kogan, Rabbi Joyce Newmark, Rabbi Cheryl Peretz, and the United Synagogue Torah Spark series for their various teachings and publications on this week's Parsha. This Shabbat, August 15th, we read the Parsha of Re'eh, the fourth Parsha in the book of Devarim, which begins on page 1061 of the Eitz Chaim Chumash and page 799 of the Hertz. Parshat Re'eh continues Moshe's second speech to the Israelites. In this Parsha, the emphasis changes from history to law. It begins with Moshe telling the people, "See, I set before you this day a blessing and a curse." They are being given a choice. They can choose a life of blessings by obeying God's commandments, or choose a life of curses for disobeying. Moshe appeals to the people to choose a life of blessing, a life in the service of God. Upon entering the land, Israel is to reaffirm this fundamental choice at a ritual ceremony confirming the covenant on Mount Gerizim and on Mount Ebal. Moshe now begins to review the commandments that God has given to Israel. The major theme of this section of the Parsha is the centralization of worship in one holy spot that God will choose. Israel is commanded to destroy the idols and pagan sanctuaries it finds in Canaan. After that, they are not allowed to worship God in these places. Instead, Israelite sacrifices are to be offered at a single sacred location which God will designate. This sacred center will be the only place where it may eat sacrificial food. The requirement of a central place of worship tended to unify the tribes and prevent divisions within the faith. Eventually, this place would be the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. The Israelites are permitted to slaughter animals intended for food and to eat that meat wherever they live, provided, as they are told repeatedly, that they do not consume the blood. This is a reminder that appears no less than 6 times in the Torah, a stern warning not to consume blood. Rak chazak, be strong, that you do not eat blood. According to some biblical commentators, this is because other Near Eastern ancient cultures were very enthusiastic about consuming blood in their idol worship ceremonies. So overcoming this urge was yet another way our ancestors affirmed their rejection of idolatry. They are admonished not to forget to provide for the Levites who had no territorial allotment. The core of this Torah portion are these laws whose intent are to create a spiritual distance between the Israelites and their pagan neighbors. The Israelites are not only forbidden to engage in idolatry, but also forbidden to incorporate elements of pagan worship into Israelite practice. Israel is commanded not to adopt the pagan worship practices of Canaan, nor even to inquire about or investigate their forms of worship, which include, notably, child sacrifice to Molech. Absolute fidelity to God's law is commanded. Israel may neither add to it nor take away from it. The Israelites are specifically warned not to be lured into foreign worship by prophets or diviners even if that person is able to produce signs and wonders. Not even should the enticer be a trusted loved one, a brother, a son, a daughter, a wife, or a dear friend. If he or she urges the people to turn away from God, he or she is a false prophet and must be put to death. Any such enticer, familial or prophetic, is to be stoned. Should it be discovered after thorough investigation that an entire Israelite town has turned away from God and been seduced into idolatry, all its inhabitants are to be put to death, and the town itself, together with all its property, must be destroyed, never to be rebuilt. The people are warned against extreme mourning rites, such as self-mutilation by gashing. These are prohibited by law. In later rabbinic law, this commandment is understood to prohibit communal disfigurement through decisive and sectarian partisan politics. Once again, Moshe summarizes the dietary laws. Only animals that have a split hoof and chew their cud can be eaten. Fish must have fins and scales, and there is a long list of forbidden birds, mostly birds of prey. Prohibited and permitted species of animals, land animals, birds, and sea life are listed as a further expression of Israelite holiness. This section concludes with a third repetition of the prohibition not to boil a kid in its mother's milk. Significantly, here this verse is placed in the context of dietary laws for the first time. Until now, it had been discussed as a forbidden pagan practice. Laws of tithing are followed by a further undertaking in the interests of financial and social justice, the prescribed forgiving of debts in the 7th year, the Shemitah, or the sabbatical year. In the same spirit, the religious imperative to provide for the poor is laid out. Israelites who are concerned about the possibility that borrowers might default are warned not to withhold funds from the needy as the remission of debts in the 7th year approaches. Such behavior is deemed base in character. Israelites who enter into indentured servitude, perhaps out of financial desperation, may be kept as servants for 6 years. In the 7th year, they must be released. At the end of their indentured period, such servants must be provided with appropriate material goods. The nation that remembers enslavement in Egypt is compelled to treat its own servants compassionately, to humanize the institution of slavery. Slaves grateful for such kindly treatment may opt out of the scheduled manumission, the scheduled release, choosing permanent indenture instead. It is commanded that all firstborn livestock are sanctified by God and must be consumed only at his chosen shrine. The Parsha concludes with a review of the pilgrimage festival, on which these passages are read. Passover, the Omer counting period of 7 weeks leading up to Shavuot, Shavuot itself, and Sukkot. The Haftorah for this Shabbat is from the book of Isaiah, chapter 54, verse 11, through chapter 55, verse 5, beginning on page 1085 of the Eitz Chaim Chumash and page 818 of the Hertz. Just as in the past few weeks, this Haftorah is not connected to this week's Torah portion of Re'eh by theme. Rather, it was chosen as the third of 7 Haftorot of consolation that follow Tisha B'Av. Bold promises of physical and spiritual transformation introduce this reading from Isaiah. God promises a spectacular rebuilding of Zion, a thorough restoration to raise it out of a depressing situation. The central promise is, no weapon that is formed against thee shall prosper, and every tongue that shall rise against thee in judgment thou shalt condemn. But the fulfillment of this promise is dependent on Israel's right choice in regards to the two options with which the Sedra opens. Behold, I set before you this day a blessing and a curse. Shabbat Shalom, good Shabbos. Thank you for viewing. Be sure to like and subscribe.